In this video, I will be covering the history of Sony Music Publishing, more focusing on the catalogs and labels owned, leading them to becoming one of the big three top publishers in the world. I was inspired to make this video after I talked about all the music catalogs that Michael Jackson owned because he does have an important role in Sony history. I don't like to waste time, so let's get right into this video. If you enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe as it would help my growing channel a lot. To start with some background, we need to go back to the 1960s. During this time, a United Kingdom television company, Associated Television, also known as ATV, was buying up catalogs left and right, acquiring different publishing companies, leading them to owning the rights for the legendary Beatles group by 1969. ATV owning that legendary catalog would play a pivotal role in the creation of Sony. Decades later, in 1985, Michael Jackson would have the opportunity to bid and buy all of ATV, including the Beatles catalog, for $47.5 million. In my Michael Jackson catalog video, I did talk about the feud that went on between himself and the Beatles once the catalog was purchased, so go check that out if interested. That piece is just not relevant to this video. 10 years after Michael Jackson bought the ATV catalog, he would strike a deal with Sony, selling 50% of the catalog for $95 million, leading to the creation of the Sony ATV publishing company. What a crazy flip though, after 10 years selling half of the catalog for double what he bought it for. This deal would give Sony a giant hand in the music publishing world that would only grow. For the next few decades, Sony ATV would grow with new artists, expanding their catalogs owned, but the ownership still was 50% owned by Sony and 50% owned by Michael Jackson. It wasn't until 2016 when Michael Jackson's estate sold the rest of their ownership in Sony for $750 million. After this big buyout, Sony ATV was solely a Sony company and would rebrand their name to Sony Music Publishing in 2021, leading us to where it is today. So now that we have talked about the history of Sony Music Publishing, we can talk about how big Sony Music Publishing really is. You can tell by the numbers involved, but let's talk about some of the names too. To start things off, Sony does still own the Beatles catalog. I can't see them ever giving that up because of the significance the catalog has and the value it brings to the table. It is now estimated that the Beatles catalog alone is worth over $1 billion, and we saw a hint of that with the Michael Jackson ATV sale in 2016. The Beatles catalog is one that the value will increase with age while it continues to collect royalties for decades to come. This type of catalog is considered an evergreen catalog. Basically, an evergreen catalog is one with popular songs that stay popular for decades. So, the Beatles catalog was Sony's first evergreen catalog, but it wasn't their last. While you may think Michael Jackson's catalog would be a part of Sony, he actually kept it separate and his estate still owns 100%. However, as of recently, there has been talks about Sony buying 50% of his catalog for $900 million, but that has not gone through yet. If it does, it will only make Sony a bigger powerhouse. Something to consider is that since Sony is a big three at the top of the pyramid, the giant has many subsidiaries that all tie back to them. Sony owns labels that owns labels. The first round of labels owned include Columbia Records, RCA Records, Epic Records, Arista Records, RCA Nashville, Columbia Nashville, Legacy Recordings, Sony Music Latin, Masterworks, RCA Inspiration, Provident Label Group, and Sony Classical. Some of your favorite artists then start labels under those labels, like A$AP Rocky with ASAP and RCA. In some way or another, most artists can be tied back to Sony. The main way Sony Music Publishing grew to the level it is at was from buying publishing companies. Michael Jackson bought ATV, then Sony bought 50% of ATV to form Sony ATV. Over the course of Sony Music Publishing, they have continued to acquire labels and publishing companies to deepen their portfolio. In May 2007, Sony ATV, before it became Sony Music Publishing, would acquire the label Famous Music for $370 million. This would be a big move by the company and Michael Jackson at the time, as this purchase included over 125,000 songs, including evergreen songs like Footloose, Silver Bells, That's Amore, and more. As I mentioned in my Michael Jackson catalog video, this deal with Famous Music would also include the catalog of Eminem, who Michael Jackson wanted to get back for a diss from a couple years before. The 2007 Famous Music acquisition played an important role in the 2000s as it would add more modern songs to the catalog along with the evergreen. In 2013, Sony would announce a global strategic partnership with the dance label Ultra Records. Ultra Records is home to artists like Steve Aoki, Deadmau5, Louis the Child, Pitbull, and more. Initially, this partnership brought on just a small percent ownership in the label for Sony. Almost a decade later, in 2022, it would be announced that Sony now has full ownership of Ultra Records. There was no disclosed amount, as this appears to have been creeping up since the initial deal. Sony Music Publishing is picking up major labels from all genres to build that diversity. In 2015, Sony Music Publishing would acquire the German metal label Century Media Records for $17 million. Now, this was one of the smallest acquisitions mentioned in the entire video, but the purpose behind this was not to buy evergreen catalogs or anything like that. The purpose of this purchase was to set up more strength in rock genres. Century was shopping around with the other two major labels, but chose Sony due to the opportunity. This is a long-term build play. In 2018, Sony Music Publishing would take part in the $2.5 billion purchase of EMI Music Publishing. EMI Music Publishing was founded in 1974 in the United Kingdom and would gain rights to over 2.1 million songs. Some catalogs owned include Lenny Kravitz and Ozzy Osbourne. EMI did have ownership into Motown Records, meaning Sony Music would then have ownership into those catalogs like Stevie Wonder. EMI has also released songs for Drake, Pharrell Williams, Kanye West, Pink, Calvin Harris, and more, collecting that 2 million catalog. The $2.5 billion purchase from Sony into EMI was a major acquisition with clear long-term earning potential. The last major acquisition I want to talk about comes from 2022 with purchasing the AWAL distributor from Cobalt Music Group for $430 million. Now, this is very different from the past acquisitions I have mentioned, as AWAL is actually a service for independent artists. Artists can submit an application to join the distribution team, where they then can renew their contract every 30 days for distribution with a 15% share of revenue. This is a great way for independent artists to get fair distribution without being stuck in a deal. Sony acquiring AWAL for $430 million is not to acquire new catalogs, but to build a division for independent artists. Artists are aware of harmful label deals, and that is why we are seeing a boom of independent artists. By tapping into the independent market with AWAL, this keeps revenue flowing back to Sony, where they would have lost money otherwise. Overall, when you talk about acquiring labels, this has been the bread and butter for Sony since the beginning. That is how Sony ATV began in the first place, was from buying 50% of ATV from Michael Jackson. Over the past few years, we have seen Sony bring in more evergreen catalogs to deepen their legendary portfolio, but also expand to modern times with genres and independent artists. Sony has a hand in almost any genre you can think of. These tactics are what keep them leading the big three, but wait, there's more. More recently, we have seen a shift from Sony buying publishing companies to them going directly to the artists to buy rights. One catalog that I have talked about before on my channel comes from the Born in the USA artist, Bruce Springsteen. Over the past year, I have covered a lot of music catalogs that have been bought by investment firms or major labels. This has always been happening, as you can tell from this video, but it seems that now more than ever, artists are in a position to sell their catalog. It doesn't hurt that they are getting all-time high valuations. Well, in December 2021, Bruce Springsteen sold his catalog publishing rights to Sony for $550 million. $500 million for one catalog, but that is one they are adding to their evergreen catalog to bring income in for decades. months. Bruce Springsteen has sold over 150 million records worldwide, and that is a major catalog to own. The Bruce Springsteen deal was later followed up by the Bob Dylan deal a month later in January 2022. Bob Dylan, the legendary singer-songwriter, sold his publishing catalog to Sony for between 150 and 200 million. Interestingly, in 2020, Bob Dylan sold his songwriting catalog, different than publishing, to Universal Music Group for 200 million. For one, that is two major deals for him. Wow. And two, Sony and Universal do now work together on Bob Dylan's catalog. In the span of 2 months, Sony bought catalogs of Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan for up to 750 million, some big acquisitions in recent times to keep them on top. It was reported in 10 months leading up to February 2022, Sony Music Publishing invested over 900 million into music catalogs. That does include those two deals mentioned, but Sony continued to add on to their catalog other than that. The buying and selling of catalogs are not going away, and Sony is there to take as much as they can. Along with all the catalogs and labels that Sony Music Publishing owns, they also manage music as well. This is another big source of revenue for them, as this is mainly done through administration deals. That is where we see other parties, typically the artist, owning their own music and partnering with a publishing company to release their music. In this case, Sony manages the music of Queen and Michael Jackson exclusively. Sony has also managed music for Jay-Z, Beyonce, Ed Sheeran, Lady Gaga, Rihanna, Diddy, and more. While that is a big source of revenue, my focus is around the catalogs and labels owned by Sony Music Publishing. In 2023, Sony Music Publishing has been buying even more catalogs. There has been a shift from buying publishing companies to individual catalogs. The acquisition of publishing companies won't go away, as that's what made Sony what it is today, and publishing companies will continue to go on the market. However, going direct to artists seems to be the new direction going forward, and that is reflected in the high valuation deals from 2021 and 2022. Sony Music Publishing became a big three in the music industry after decades of strategic moves with acquisitions to where almost everything and everyone can be tied back to them in some way. If you are interested in me covering the other big three labels, Warner Music Group and Universal Music Group, let me know in the comments below. Invest in me by leaving a like and subscribing if you found this video informational. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.